A Blackland Prairie spanning thousands of acres in Texas has now been devastated and reduced to an area smaller than a tiny backyard. At the same time, across the skies of North America, out of every 10 meadowlarks that once filled the air with song, fewer than 3 remain today. Behind this massive disappearance lies far more than just numbers. It is the terrifying silence of a landscape slowly losing the very sound of life. That is why the new owner's actions on this land were not merely unusual. They were seemingly irrational. To save an ecosystem that had been grazed to the point of collapse, Mark Brown deliberately set fire to the very land he had spent years trying to protect. Just a few weeks later, a herd of cattle moved into the freshly burned area and began helping the prairie come back to life. To understand how this could possibly happen, we first have to go back to the year 2000, when the Brown family's land still looked like the surface of the moon. 2 centuries ago, this land was an ocean of grass, a sea of vegetation so tall that it could completely hide a person on horseback. Grasses such as big bluestem and Indian grass grew to more than 2 meters in height, while their roots reached several meters deep into the soil, forming a gigantic natural sponge capable of absorbing even the heaviest rainstorms. Scattered throughout this vast prairie were hundreds of species of wildflowers, creating a landscape whose colors changed with every season. This ecosystem was never static. It was shaped by 2 powerful natural forces: fire and grazing animals. Summer storms often brought lightning, igniting natural wildfires that spread for hundreds of miles. These flames were not agents of destruction, they were the force of renewal. They cleared away layers of dead vegetation, returned nutrients to the soil, allowed sunlight to reach the ground, and eliminated young woody plants attempting to invade the prairie. Fire created a patchwork mosaic of burned areas at different stages of recovery, providing diverse habitats for countless species. The second force was the enormous herds of American bison, whose population across the continent was estimated at between 30 million and 60 million animals. They moved constantly, like a living tide. When a herd reached an area, it transformed it with remarkable intensity, grazing the grass, trampling the ground, and leaving behind vast amounts of natural fertilizer. Their hooves churned the topsoil, helping seeds come into direct contact with the earth. As they rolled in the mud, they created shallow depressions. These depressions later filled with rainwater, becoming temporary ponds for insects and amphibians. But most importantly, the herds would eventually move on, often not returning for many months, or even several years. The land experienced intense disturbance, followed by an exceptionally long period of rest, allowing it to recover and become even more resilient. This ancient rhythm, intense disturbance followed by extended rest, was the very foundation of how the prairie functioned. When barbed wire was introduced in the 19th century, it did more than divide the prairie, it severed its lifeblood. To Native Americans, the Blackland Prairie and the great bison herds embodied freedom and dignity. But when settlers arrived, they not only hunted the bison to the brink of extinction in order to destroy the indigenous people's source of survival, they also transformed the vast ocean of tall grass into cramped, fenced-off squares. Keeping livestock confined behind fences, century after century, was like driving a giant nail into the chest of the ecosystem itself, causing it to slowly suffocate from within. The collapse did not happen overnight. It unfolded over many decades, a slow and ultimately unavoidable death. The numbers provide cold, undeniable evidence of the scale of the devastation. Of the original 12 million acres of Blackland Prairie, fewer than 12,000 acres remain today, a decline of more than 99.9%. The northern bobwhite, the prairie's iconic quail, has declined by nearly 80%. The loggerhead shrike, a small predatory songbird, has declined by roughly 3/4. This was not merely a decline, it was an ecological collapse on a continental scale. Prairies that once echoed with birdsong have now fallen into silence. But wait. Uncontrolled grazing and the suppression of natural fire were only the surface of the problem. The deeper reason the ecosystem lost its ability to heal itself was far more subtle, hidden beneath a visual illusion that scientists call a green desert. Have you ever looked at a lush green field yet somehow felt that it was strangely empty? If so, you were most likely witnessing this very phenomenon. In an effort to improve the land, property owners did what they believed was the right thing. They removed the diverse native grasses and replaced them with just a few imported grass species, commonly known as improved pastures. These grasses, such as Bermuda grass and Old World bluestem, grow extremely fast, producing a uniform carpet of lush green vegetation that appears highly productive. From a distance, it looks like an agricultural success story. But the moment you step inside, you notice the difference immediately. The silence. Native plants evolved alongside native insects over thousands of years, forming a complex food web. In contrast, these imported grasses are almost complete strangers to the ecosystem. Native insects cannot feed on them. Caterpillars cannot survive on their leaves. Bees cannot find suitable pollen. As a result, a beautiful, lush green pasture becomes a biological desert. Without insects, there is no food for birds. Young chicks require enormous amounts of protein from insects in order to grow. A grassland without insects is a place that cannot support the next generation of birds. Even worse, these imported grasses provide poor quality forage for the very livestock they were planted to feed, and they require annual applications of chemical fertilizers simply to maintain their green appearance. This creates a cycle of chemical dependency that degrades soil health and pollutes water sources. Gradually, the soil loses its organic matter, becomes compacted, and grows increasingly vulnerable to erosion. This is the perfect trap. A dead landscape disguised in the colors of life. It deceives the eye while concealing a terrifying truth: the entire foundation of the food chain has been completely shattered. And it was on land exactly like this, a landscape exhausted by overgrazing, deprived of fire, and poisoned by silent green, that our restoration story begins. The scientific solution to this ecological problem began with the efforts of Mark Brown and his wife. Two people with no degrees in biology who were nevertheless willing to spend years experimenting on their own land. They were not scientists or conservation experts. They were simply people who had purchased a piece of land that nobody else wanted, and their toolkit seemed far too simple for the scale of the destruction they faced: a pair of pruning shears to clear invasive shrubs, a dozen cows, and a box of matches. Their logic was deeply unusual, and it contradicted everything people had been taught about conservation. Instead of fencing off the land and leaving it untouched, they decided to bring disturbance back, but in a controlled way. The process was anything but quick. The early years were filled with frustration. After clearing the land, Mark Brown began his journey by spraying herbicide in an attempt to kill the stubborn, invasive grasses that continued to hold their ground, and then he sowed the first native seeds across a 30-acre experimental plot. After months of relentless hand-sawing and thousands of dollars spent on seeds, Mark Brown waited for a miracle. A green carpet began to emerge. It looked as though they had won, and the prairie had returned. But the truth was far more complicated and bitter. That green carpet was not native grass, but an even more aggressive wave of the old invasive species, strengthened by the freshly disturbed soil. The land looked like a devastated battlefield, and for the next 3 years, not a single wildflower appeared. The roots of the native grasses were still quietly pushing deep into the soil, but above the surface, the land offered only a silence filled with despair. The conflict did not end there, because it intensified when Mark decided to strike a match and start a fire. In the middle of dry Texas, the act of setting a prairie ablaze by an untrained outsider was viewed by his neighbors as insane and extremely dangerous. Black smoke rose into the sky. While complaints, community skepticism, and pressure from local fire safety regulations weighed heavily on the couple, they became isolated within their own attempt to save the land. If the fire escaped control and spread to a neighboring ranch, Mark Brown would not only face imprisonment, but the entire project would be brought to an immediate end. During the early years, the ground showed almost no clear signs of recovery, because most of the native grass's energy was being used to build root systems beneath the soil. After that, it was mostly unwanted weeds that appeared. Almost anyone would have given up at this stage. But they continued. They did not herd the cattle. They set fire to a section of land covering roughly 30 to 40 acres. The flames swept across it very quickly, burning only the dry grass on the surface, without damaging the roots buried deep underground. A few weeks later, something extraordinary happened. From the ashes, young shoots of native grass began to emerge. These new shoots were exceptionally tender, fresh, and rich in protein. To a cow, this was an irresistible meal. Without anyone driving them, the entire herd automatically moved toward the recently burned area and concentrated its grazing there. Later research using global positioning system collars confirmed this behavior. Cattle spend around 70% of their time on the most recently burned patch. The fire had created a biological magnet. The cattle followed the flames, and the torch became the fence. While the cattle were concentrated in one small area, the rest of the ranch, about 90% of the land, was allowed to rest completely. It was neither grazed nor trampled. The following year, they would burn a different section, and the entire herd would move with it. In this way, they recreated the ancient rhythm of the prairie, one area exposed to intense disturbance, followed by a very long period of rest. And then, very slowly, the land began to respond. The recovery did not come from the expensive seeds they had planted. It came from something that had always been there, buried and forgotten. Beneath every square meter of prairie soil, even in the most barren landscapes, there may be a seed bank containing tens of thousands of seeds from native plant species. These seeds can remain dormant for many decades, and some species can even wait for an entire century, holding out for the right signals to germinate: sunlight, reaching bare soil, a small amount of moisture, and disturbance. The fire cleared away the dead grass, allowing sunlight to reach the ground. The cattle's hooves lightly disturbed the topsoil, helping the seeds make contact with moist earth. They were not truly planting a prairie. They were unlocking a prairie that had always been there, waiting beneath their feet. Wildflowers began to appear, followed by native grasses. They eventually identified more than 220 different plant species, a number almost equal to that of an original prairie that had never been plowed. But this is where most stories about nature's miracles would end. This one does not. The truth is far more complex. This prairie is not something that has simply been fixed. It is not a finished painting that you can hang on a wall and admire. It is a living system, a flame that must be tended continuously. Stop the prescribed burns, remove the cattle, and within just a few years, invasive shrubs will creep back, non-native grasses from neighboring lands will spread in, and the entire system will slide back into a biological wasteland. This is a lifelong commitment, not a project with an ending. The real challenge was not only ecological. It was a battle against a century of agricultural dogma. At first, their neighbors were skeptical. Their ranch looked messy and untidy compared with the lush, uniform green pastures surrounding it. But then people began to notice the difference. When drought arrived, the restored prairie remained greener because the deep roots of native plants retained moisture, while neighboring pastures withered away. Their soil absorbed rainwater like a sponge instead of letting it run off, reducing erosion. Their cattle were healthier while requiring less supplemental feed. But was this model truly economically sustainable? The answer is yes, and that is a crucial part of the story. The initial costs of seeds and land restoration could be supported through conservation cost-sharing programs funded by government agencies and non-profit organizations. Over the long term, eliminating the need for chemical fertilizers and reducing supplemental feed for livestock resulted in substantial savings. The success of the Brown family's ranch gradually became the most convincing evidence of all. Neighboring landowners began visiting, learning, and adopting the same techniques. Today, around 50 landowners across the region have joined the effort, gradually connecting isolated prairie fragments into a much larger ecological network. And once the foundation was healed, the entire ecological structure began to stand on its own again. The landowners never tried to bring the birds back. They never tried to bring the monarch butterflies back. Instead, they restored the foundation upon which those creatures depended. Milkweed, the only food plant for monarch caterpillars, returned on its own. Now, every autumn, thousands of monarch butterflies once again blanket acres of their ranch, creating a vital stopover along their migration of thousands of miles to Mexico. Native plants brought native insects back. Native insects and native seeds brought the prairie birds back. When you heal the foundation, the entire structure restores itself. To scientists, this was a restored ecosystem. But in the history of this land, it represented the revival of a far deeper memory. These domestic cattle were not merely livestock, they were fulfilling the ecological role once played by the vanished American bison. They were bringing intentional disturbance back to a landscape that had been forced into silence for far too long. They were a tool, not the final product. The story in Texas has grown far beyond the boundaries of a single ranch, or even a single state. It has become a precedent, living proof of a broader philosophy that is spreading across the world under the name regenerative agriculture. From the arid landscapes of Africa, where biologist Alan Savory demonstrated ecosystem recovery through holistic planned grazing, to the rewilding movement in Europe, with the Napa state in England standing as a leading example where free-ranging large herbivores have triggered an explosion of biodiversity, a new way of thinking is emerging. That philosophy says this healing does not always mean protecting nature by leaving it alone. Sometimes, it means bringing back the right kind of disturbance, with the right intensity, at the right time. Their success has been recognized at the highest level. In recent years, the owners of this land received the Leopold Conservation Award, widely regarded as the highest honor for private landowners in the United States. Their model is no longer a personal experiment, it is now studied and recognized by organizations such as the United States Department of Agriculture as a leading example of climate-smart agricultural practices, offering a pathway through which land can simultaneously produce food, store carbon, and support biodiversity. More than 20 years later, there is no longer silence across those 80 acres of land. Instead of hearing only the wind, there are now the sounds of thousands of insects, birds singing, and grasses swaying. The land has come back to life through sound. But the real question remains, and it is far greater than these 80 acres. Can an ecosystem continuously maintained by humans through fire and livestock truly be considered wild? Or has it become something else, a carefully managed garden? A system permanently dependent on the very hands that once destroyed it? The answer may not be simple, but the search for it is reshaping how we understand our role on this planet. It shows that human beings do not always have to be destroyers. We can become caretakers, restorers, and those who restart a process that nature has known how to perform for a very long time. The journey of Mark Brown and his wife offers a broader lesson for modern conservation science. Human beings are not always outsiders standing apart from nature and granting it salvation. Healing a shattered ecosystem does not mean sealing it inside a sterile glass case and isolating it completely from every form of disturbance. Sometimes, it requires the courage to return the harshest forces such as fire and hooves to their rightful place. Today, the Brown family's 200 acres, together with 50 neighboring ranches, have been connected into a green corridor, but it is still only a tiny point of light on the map of a continent that was once stripped bare. The flames across the Blackland Prairie must still be rekindled every year. Because the moment people loosen their grip, the green glacier will swallow everything once again. The struggle to restore Earth's true green has never had a complete ending. It is a long-term commitment, beginning with a single match struck with faith and a profound understanding of nature.